and if these cases are true, these levels are extremely serious and often highly disturbing to the experiencers. At the very least, they're kidnapping. In a human legal system, they would be considered violent criminal acts. Hello everyone, I'm Suzanne, and I'm here with John, ready for another episode of God and the Paranormal, a podcast exploring high strangeness from a biblical worldview. Thanks for joining us.
You know, this may be a good time to mention once again, kind of the thrust of our podcast.
Yes.
We know that some listeners may jump in and start listening with just about any episode.
Yeah, I do that sometimes.
Yeah, me too. When I find a new podcast, I kind of hop around and listen to various episodes that seem interesting first, I think.
But some of our episodes build on each other to some extent. For example, today's episode involves some background from episodes 18 and 20.
And of course, listeners can do anything they want. Many of our episodes might be easier to follow if listeners went consecutively.
I would definitely recommend new listeners hear episodes 1, 2, and 3 first.
Yeah.
Those sort of lay the foundation for the podcast and what we're talking about.
Uh-huh.
And while we're going to gradually work up to a discussion of the true nature of UFOs and ETs.
Yeah, we've looked at several prominent UFO incidents that I think give kind of a good sampling of the phenomenon in general.
Right. And so far, we've been exploring UFO reports of mostly the first and second kinds. To summarize, a first kind of experience is when an unidentified flying object is observed at relatively close range, and you can make out basic features such as shape or color. And a second kind event is when physical evidence is experienced, such as tracks, radar blips, or sounds.
And we have touched on some third kind incidents, I think, those in which some kind of NHI, and remember that's a non-human intelligence, when that's observed in or with some UFO.
And some things do extend Dr. Hynek's scale to describe more intense experiences, such as being forcibly manipulated in some way by an ET. This is clearly more serious than just observing a phenomenon.
Yeah, the most recent Roper poll that I could find indicated that almost 4 million Americans claim not simply seeing a UFO, but they have memories of being abducted or physically manipulated in some way by what they perceive to be occupants of a UFO.
That's a really high number.
It is.
That's about 1 in 100.
Uh-huh.
And anecdotal evidence indicates that number could be even higher today, right?
Yeah. And whether experiencers actually did have a real experience or not, the important thing is that so many people believe they've personally experienced an ET. It's changing the worldviews of a significant part of our culture, I think.
I agree. You know, when you dig into these third kind incidents, they seem to be more than just moving up a level on the scale.
And I believe these actually give us a lot of insight into the nature of the UFO phenomenon as a whole. So for one more episode, let's continue what we've done in previous UFO episodes and just look at the data in more of a documentary style.
Okay, so for one more episode, no analyses, no judgments,
No,
just
not
yet.
yet.
We're going to get there eventually.
Yeah. So if we're still trying to classify close encounters with UFOs, some would use the extended Hynek scale that you mentioned and say that abductions would be close encounters of the fourth kind.
And I might add, Hynek's colleague, Jacques Vallée, claimed that the fourth kind should refer to, quote, cases when witnesses experience a transformation of their sense of reality, quote. That would include some non-abduction cases where bizarre, hallucinatory, or dreamlike events are associated with UFO encounters.
Yeah. And we'll stick with that too, I think. When we say abduction, we're including being taken aboard a craft, dreamlike experiences with some sort of entity, any involuntary high strangeness event that seems to be associated with a non-human entity.
And these modern fourth kind cases do get a lot darker and fringier than the first and second kind sightings. So here's just a heads up.
Right. It's a huge jump to go from first and second kinds to third and fourth. And as we mentioned, these qualitatively differ in many ways, far different from just, hey, I just saw a light flying across the sky. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, and if these cases are true, these levels are extremely serious and often highly disturbing to the experiencers.
Hmm.
At the very least, they're kidnapping. In a human legal system, they would be considered violent criminal acts.
Very true.
Okay, let's start with probably the most talked about abduction event on record, the 1961 Barney and Betty Hill case.
Yeah, just as Roswell has become the landmark kind of a UFO cover up, the Hill account was one of the earliest dark abduction reports that we have. And I use the term dark because prior to the Hill incident, mostly in the 40s and 50s, there were many accounts of extraterrestrial contact going around, but these were generally of a kind of happy nature. One of the most well-known early contactee was George Adamski. He was a maintenance worker in Yellowstone Park, and he wrote about numerous meetings with the inhabitants of our local solar system. He became famous with the book, The Saucers Have Landed.
Yeah, he and the aliens from Venus and Mars allegedly talked at length in several books worth of chatter.
And he inspired a lot of his contemporaries, such as Howard Menger, Gabriel Green, Frank Stranges.
And a lot of cultish groups like the Aetherius Society,
Uh-huh.
which is still going on today.
Yeah, right. But basically, almost all of these early contactees reported benign, friendly aliens. It's unclear whether Betty or Barney Hill had read any of this material, though.
Mm.
But whatever the case, their account was much darker and scarier than those from the 50s versions. Their report got a lot of publicity, and it involved many of the same earmarks of more modern third kind experiences and up to the present.
Yeah. Okay, I'll read an excerpt from your book. Barney and Betty Hill, husband and wife, were driving home from vacation to their home in New Hampshire when Betty noticed a bright light that seemed to be following them. Barney stopped and got out of the car for a better look. As the object came closer, he could see that it was a large saucer-shaped craft with windows along the edge. Barney claims he could see odd, uniformed beings watching him through the windows. At that point, he ran back to the car and they hurried away as the saucer followed. They both told of strange beeping sounds coming from the trunk and feeling of some type of energy passing through their bodies. The next thing the Hills remember was regaining consciousness about 30 miles down the road. Upon arriving at home, they realized the trip had taken 2 hours longer than expected. In the following days, Betty began poring over books about UFOs. After reading of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, she contacted the group and filed a report of their encounter.
So up to this point, this would just be another of the 61% group we discussed.
Yes, that quote, not enough information quote category, where an observation is made, but there is a dead end to any further investigations.
Right. But Betty was persistent. She believed that they had witnessed something.
Okay, so continuing from your book. Over the next years, Betty experienced vivid nightmares in which she and Barney were on board a craft undergoing some type of medical examination. Betty underwent months of psychological therapy, wrestling with new horrifying memories. Much of her treatment involved hypnosis. During these hypnotic regression sessions, she eventually pieced together more details of the couple's ordeal.
So hypnotic regression. This is used a lot in various paranormal incidents, a very controversial procedure in both inside and outside the psychological community.
Mm-hmm.
Psychologists who use it claim that under hypnosis, a subject can more easily remember details about past events. They say a patient can be regressed back to an earlier time of life and maybe see hidden memories that can be uncovered.
I've also heard of cases where false memories become a problem.
Yeah.
Several in particular in which the patient left the session with terrifying memories of events that were found later not to have ever happened.
And that's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
How do you tell whether a memory is false or real?
People under hypnosis are highly suggestible, I've heard. If
Yeah.
the therapist phrases the conversation a certain way, the subject can follow that lead, so to speak.
Confirmation bias, it's called.
Mm.
Patients can also confabulate events, supposedly, possibly mixing real memories with memories of movies or books they've read. And I'm not suggesting hypnotherapy has no use. It may be a good tool in some cases, but many researchers believe it's not reliable enough in general to shape our views of really serious events.
It's really fascinating. But
Mhm.
anyway, Barney and Betty had extensive hypnotherapy, including regression, which supposedly took them back to the event.
And by the way, this is how most of the information about the incident was retrieved. The only physical evidence was Barney's scuffed shoes and
Mm.
some questionable marks on Betty's dress.
Yeah, here are some of the unusual things they claim to have remembered during the regression. I'm reading again from your book. During the examinations, the beings plucked strands of their hair, took clippings of their nails, and scraped their skin. Needles connected to long wires probed their heads, arms, legs, and spines. Betty Hill's hypnotherapy uncovered many fragments of her encounter. She described grayish, large-headed beings and remembered talking at length with them. During the incident, she claims a long needle was inserted into her abdomen. One of the beings explained that it was a pregnancy test. In her stories, the aliens also had a sense of humor, laughing at Barney's removable dentures.
And I think it's noteworthy here. Betty's description of the entities involved here are arguably the most commonly reported ET today. They're often called the Greys, and we've talked about that.
Yeah, the typical oval eye, thin body, big
Uh-huh.
cranial creatures. Here are some more interesting details from your book. Another curious aspect was the star chart given to Betty by one of the creatures. Under hypnosis, she redrew a map of star positions that had been placed into her mind. After the publishing of the diagram, an amateur astronomer announced that the map was from the perspective of a viewer in the star system Zeta Reticuli. Betty's followers still see this as proof of her encounter with extraterrestrials. Many astronomers, however, question the accuracy of the map.
Yeah, weird, isn't it? Zeta Reticuli. Now we know that's just a binary star about 40 light years away, and there are no known planets around it, though, which brings up again that problem of far away distances. 40 light years would just take lifetimes to get there at
Mhm.
very fast speeds.
And this star chart was from the perspective of being on Zeta looking toward Earth. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah. And with some new computer modeling, it wasn't a really good fit with the actual star positions.
Hmm. You would think if you were taking a 40 light year trip, you'd have a better map.
I would think so.
Or maybe they have had a good GPS system.
Yeah. But this was certainly an iconic case, highly publicized. It convinced a lot of people of life beyond somewhere. And I remember reading about it as a child in Reader's Digest.
Wow.
And I think it did shape my 10-year-old brain to some extent.
Mm.
Skeptics say it could be the basis for future reports involving abductions, big head aliens, and medical probes and things like that.
Mm.
Anyway, Barney Hill died 8 years after the event. Betty, though, claimed to have been visited several more times by the aliens before her death in 2004.
And perhaps skeptics have a point. The Hill case may have inspired future events. It had all of the elements of what would become the quintessential alien
Mhm.
abduction.
Yeah, and whatever the case, many future abduction reports were very similar to this one.
Here's another famous or infamous abduction incident from Pascagoula, Mississippi. The evening of October 11, 1973, 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker were fishing on the bank of the Pascagoula River when they heard a whizzing sound and saw flashing blue lights overhead. They eventually saw an oval-shaped object 30 feet across and 10 feet high land. Parker and Hickson say they witnessed 3 humanoid creatures leave the craft. They claimed they were completely conscious, but paralyzed as the beings with crab-like arms took them aboard.
So both claimed to have floated into the object, and they underwent what seemed to be physical exams, just like the Hills did. Hickson said the probe was like an eyeball on a mechanical arm, whatever that is.
And at some point, the two suddenly found themselves back on the riverbank with no creatures or craft around. Again, somewhat like the Hill account.
Yeah, Hickson and Parker then went to the sheriff and reported the event. It seemed the sheriff and others didn't know what to make of it. They determined the two weren't drunk, and fortunately for future UFO buffs, a tape recorder was secretly running during the interviews.
Hmm.
There is a factor that lends some credibility to the story. The tape shows that when the men were left alone, they continued to talk about the events. It seemed that they were still genuinely scared about the event.
And from a skeptic's point of view, that could have been faked or planned in advance.
Yeah, yeah. But the officers didn't perceive it that way. There is a lot of written information. To the authorities, it was a coherent, believable account. And I think we can ask this in most incidents we discuss. Did someone stand to benefit from their story? In most cases, including this one, you have to conclude, well, probably not. And I could be wrong, but until recently, the stigma of alleging something like this far outweighed any possible benefits from it.
Yeah.
It's typical to hear experiencers say that they wish they had never made it public.
Mm. I wonder if that does keep a lot of people from reporting anything.
Yeah, very possible. I guess you could argue that for some people, any attention is good attention, though.
Yeah.
And like the Hill case, Parker and Hickson have had a lot of attention. They were interviewed on The Tonight Show. Parker is still featured at UFO conventions. He's published a book about the account, too.
Mm.
But neither benefited a lot financially. And you have all the ridicule and social issues of the event.
Yeah.
It's usually not in one's best interest to keep saying, yeah, I'm the guy that got probed by aliens.
Well, would you go public if something like this happened to you?
I've asked myself that, and I really don't know. I guess it really depends on the event and, the situation around it, I think.
I think it would be easier to go public if you knew you were going to have some kind of justice or
Yeah, and it's definitely
resolution.
easier in contemporary times today than I think it was back then.
Yeah.
Now, let's contrast the Pascagoula incident with another reported event, the Travis Walton case. This is likely the most controversial case of all time, almost 50 years old now, and this incident would make an excellent movie. In fact, there is a movie about it. It adds yet another layer of confusion and keeps the controversy alive.
Yeah, here's a synopsis of what Walton claims. November 5th, 1975, forestry worker Travis Walton in a national forest near Heber, Arizona. Walton was on a logging crew working for his future brother-in-law, Mike Rogers. On November 5th, the 8 men recount starting home after sunset when they saw a bright light just off the road. Walton jumped out and headed into the forest toward the light. The men say Walton was engulfed by a beam of light. They quickly left to get help. Police organized search parties that failed to find Walton or any evidence of the event. After 5 days, however, Walton remembers waking up in Heber. He called his sister from a phone booth there. Walton sold his story to tabloid The National Enquirer, which published the account and awarded the crew a $5,000 prize. In 1978, he wrote The Walton Experience, which was adapted into the 1993 film Fire in the Sky.
Yeah, and like the Hills, he says he remembers being on some kind of table, being probed and examined. There were short, bald aliens, and in his case, 3 humans operating the devices.
Oh, wow. So humans helping aliens?
Yeah. This is one of the most polarizing of UFO cases. It seems like for those who hear the story, they either believe him strongly or they just discount him completely as a fraud.
And Walton has had a lot of speaking engagements.
Hmm.
A lot of details have been heavily scrutinized.
Yeah, skeptics bring up tons of criticism. For example, about a month before the incident, Walton, Rogers, and several others had been together supposedly watching the movie about Barney and Betty Hill. They reportedly talked about the possibility of UFOs and abductions.
But he was also missing for 5 days.
Yeah.
And I see several people are on record saying that Walton and his mother had long been interested in UFOs and had often discussed this with others.
Yeah. And my problem with the whole event is that it's all anecdotal. He said, she said, both believers and skeptics.
And with no physical evidence, nothing is likely to change.
No, not after 50 years. I might mention that the crew with Walton that night did supposedly pass polygraph tests, which some consider significant.
But a lot of experts put polygraph evidence right in there with hypnotic regression. It's not an exact science.
Yeah. I do think it'll continue to be a media-driven story, though, just because it already has so much momentum. It's just going to keep rolling.
And it seems to fit the mold of a typical abduction case.
Yeah, I think that's it. But does that indicate the reality of the incident or that people tend to mimic previous reports? And note, all of these cases involve more than one person. The typical abduction event has a single experiencer. So I think that will be important later in our discussion.
In episode 5, when we discussed ghosts, You mentioned Terrell, his perfect ghost model.
Uh-huh.
In your book, you follow his example and discuss what you call the perfect abduction.
Right. Terrell was the first to roll what ghost experiencers were reporting into what he called the perfect ghost scenario. So in researching the material for my book, I reviewed over 100 abduction cases, just kind of selected at random from various sources. And with that base, I then followed Terrell's strategy for modeling a typical apparition. I put together a typical or a perfect abduction description that's kind of a mosaic of what most abduction scenarios what information they give us.
Okay, so you're comparing his formula for a perfect ghost case to set up your formula for a perfect abduction case.
Yeah, just kind of a
Okay.
summary. Yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure.
So
Okay,
it
so
was
tell me
fun.
about what the perfect abduction description is.
Okay. Number one, the event starts late at night. Hardly any daytime abductions that you could find anywhere. There are a few, obviously, but out of just, the thousands that you find, mostly late at night, very late at night. The
Okay.
second one, the experiencer is alone in their bedroom or vehicle
Mm.
almost exclusively. And notice none of the cases we've discussed here actually followed this one.
Yeah.
They get a lot of media attention and they're popular, but the real typical case really is like that. It's just one person in their bedroom and it's usually late at night. So
Mm.
anyway, number three, immediately before the incident, the experiencer senses dread, general anxiety, or physical uneasiness.
That's fascinating.
It is. They have kind of a premonition or a feeling that something's about to happen. Or does that feeling lead to something happening? We'll talk
Yeah.
about that later. Number four, the event is dreamlike and ethereal. So voluntary muscle control is usually difficult or they can't move at all. They say they're paralyzed. And that's unusual too. Why wouldn't we have some that seem like real events if they were,
Yeah.
actually real events? Number five, the experiencer is transported into a room or wakes up there. Usually, if awake, he floats in a paralyzed state. Many recall passing through solid objects such as walls or ceilings.
Mm.
And that's weird too. You're
Yeah, it
kind of
is.
a ghostly out of body experience. Number six, the environment is blurry and surreal. Unusual lights are present. These tend to be bright until the abductee reaches the destination. Then everything gets a lot darker.
We talk a lot about where the spiritual line is between physical and spiritual in our worlds relating.
Yeah, and do you get on this that it does sound very creepy and ghostly sounding? So,
Yeah, when you said pass through the walls and stuff, it's like, at what point is this spiritual or physical? I mean,
uh-huh.
this is the age-old question, but keep
Yeah.
going.
Number seven, the experiencer describes laying on a surface and being probed with various metallic devices, just like we saw earlier. Most attention is focused on the head and reproductive organs, it seems.
Terrifying.
So, don't know where to go with that.
Yeah.
Number eight, a sermon is given, often telepathically, in which the abductee is enlightened about a variety of just miscellaneous, vague philosophical topics,
Oh, that's
like some
interesting.
new age idea of everything being God, or you need to stop using nuclear power, or stop the arms race, or stop polluting the earth. And why can't you all just get along with each other?
Wow.
Really philosophical things like that. Anyway, they came billions of miles across space to tell us these things. So
Right.
apparently
We
they were
talked about
important.
that when the kids had an encounter and
Yeah, aerial school.
yeah, and the aliens said like,
Uh-huh.
take care of the earth.
Number nine, the experiencer is returned to the place of the abduction or nearby. And number 10, a loss of time is noted. That's
That's
very common
interesting.
to
Yeah.
have people say that, oh, we lost 3 or 4 hours or 5 days in Travis Walton's case.
Yeah. Wow.
Number 11, experiencers with no clear conscious recollection of the event may have dreams, flashbacks, general paranoia, which lead to suspicions and fears that an alien encounter could have occurred in the past, especially when they hear someone else talking about their experiences.
Hmm.
And number 12, this is a big one. Subsequent abduction experiences are very likely. It's
Wow.
very uncommon to find someone who thinks that they've just been abducted one single time. So that's almost across the board. Just thousands of people saying it started when I was a child and it's still going on.
Oh, that's so disturbing. It also feels like the movie Independence Day.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't
So,
mean that in like it's just disturbing.
so not so much Space Brothers in any sense
Oh,
like we
yeah.
hear. And I think this needs to be addressed carefully. When we consider the characteristics of these events, skeptics often point to the similarities between experiencers and those with mental illness.
Hmm.
However, Harvard psychologist John Mack, who we mentioned earlier with the Ariel School event, he studied over 200 abductees and concluded that any psychological issues existing before the patient's abductions were not significantly different from those of just the general population.
Mack did add a degree of public acceptance of alien encounters.
Yeah, I think so. And his research revealed an unusual mixture of physical and spiritual qualities kind of woven through the abduction accounts. He wrote about the three categories of UFO ET perceptions among his patients. Look at that list there.
Okay, here's a brief summary of those. 1. Evidence in the normal physical universe. Unusual lights, radar blips, blurred patches of Earth. 2. Phenomena that appear to be explainable with physical laws if we had better technology. Speeds and maneuvers that seem impossible with our technology. Vanishing or appearing suddenly. Telepathy with humans. Telepathy with humans is hard for me to think. We just need better technology. But anyway,
Yeah.
3. Observations for which we can conceive of no explanation in the physical universe. Quote, sense that experiences are not occurring in our space-time universe. Quote, a consciousness, abductees experience of vast other realities. Deeply felt sense of opening up to or returning to the source of being or creation. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And, quote, experienced by abductees of a dual human alien identity. Clearly, the phenomena experienced in this third category seems to have crossed into another realm.
And once again, these third category experiences of Mac are qualitatively different from the former ones.
And you say this gives us a lead into exploring the true nature of all things UFO or extraterrestrial.
Yeah, I think it does. Certainly alleged ETs can do whatever they wish, but I believe we can honestly ask why this switch between seeing a UFO and experiencing an abduction. I can imagine all kinds of scenarios in which aliens just continue their Close Encounter 3 contacts in kind of a nuts and bolt form instead of a surreal, dreamlike kind of state.
It's almost like ETs try to stage unnecessary theatrics for these third kind experiences.
Uh-huh. I agree. And it seems there are much more effective ways to do whatever they're doing, I would think. Data gathering on humans, philosophical advice, disclosing themselves gently so we won't fear them.
Yeah. And they're definitely failing miserably at that.
They are. So how about we use our next episode to finally do a deep dive into these alternatives?
All right, a cliffhanger. I can't wait. We should say before we wrap up this episode that we know that whether there really were abductions or not, that it's a horrific encounter for some of these people.
Yeah,
so
it is.
we're not discussing this in a unkind way, just from a scientific
it's
data
very traumatic. Yeah.
view. Yeah. Well, we are certainly glad you joined us for this episode. Please look for episode 22 to drop in the next few days. Maybe we can get to the bottom of some UFO and ET dramas. If you would like to comment or ask questions, please send us an email at godandtheparanormal@gmail.com. You can also get more info at our website, thinkingaboutthebible.com. Whatever platform you're listening on, please subscribe, hit like, give us a thumbs up, add a comment, and especially hit share and let others know about the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye for now.